Hello, this is reading on page 58 and 59. Mr. Duffy's workshop. Grandfather wanted George to go to the Mr. Duffy's house to collect a present. The present was for the George's little cousin Sally. Mr. Duffy phoned this morning. Grandfather told George, "He's finished. Would you mind going now?" George didn't mind going at all. He loved to go to the Mr. Duffy's house at any time. He loved talking to Mr. Duffy about his work. Most of all, he was fascinated by Mr. Duffy's tool. A few minutes' walk brought George to a tall house. He knocked to an old wooden door. After a few moments, Mr. Duffy opened it. "Come along in, George," she said. "Mr. Duffy is in the workshop." She walked ahead of George a long, short passageway and stopped to open kitchen door. George caught a glimpse of palm and peaches on the kitchen table. A delicious smell of simmering fruit wafted past his nose. Mrs. Duffy pointed to an open doorway where bright sunlight fell across the single steps. "You know your way, don't you, George?" George nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Duffy," he said. George stepped into a small courtyard, brilliant with flowers cascading in a stream of white pink chrysanthemums from pots and on the window sills. In one corner, peach tree drooped its branches laden with golden fruit. Near the tree, a door stood open. George crossed to the courtyard and stepped inside Mr. Duffy's workshop. This was one of George's favorite places in all the world, and Mr. Duffy was one of his favorite people. Mr. Duffy was leaning over the workbench. On the wall beside him, a clean but well-used saw. Rows of tiny paints, pots, and varnishes stood on narrow shelves with fine, delicate brush in a long plastic box and pots of screw nails. Mr. Duffy's glasses were perched on the end of his nose, and he was looking carefully at a thick piece of wood. He ran his long finger gently over the surface. He was frowning a little with an air of concentration. He scrutinized the wood for a few seconds, then he stood up straight with an expression of satisfaction. At the moment he noticed George, he turned towards him with a welcoming smile. The most striking thing about Mr. Duffy was that he was extremely tall. The second most striking thing was that he was extremely thin. This always surprised George, as he never came to the house without smelling something delicious cooking on the stove. He wondering how Mr. Duffy stays on thin when so much tasty food was produced from Mrs. Duffy's kitchen. Mr. Duffy peered at George's thick dark eyebrows. His short, graying hair stood straight up from his head. He seemed to George like a wise old parrot, sharp-eyed and thoughtful. He always wore a long blue apron which made him look even taller and thinner. In the pocket was a short pencil, which he sharpened from time to time with a tiny penknife. "Hello, George," said Mr. Duffy. "Hello, Mr. Duffy," replied George. Mr. Duffy beckoned George to a table against one wall. This was the table where Mr. Duffy put finished pieces of the work. There was a large polished box made of gold-colored wood and small round table with intricately curved legs. Beside the table was Sally present. It was a small wooden pot. Across the middle of the pot were three little pinches around the wooden sailors with a blue putty around head and tiny pinches. Mr. Duffy lifted out one of the sailors and showed it to the George. The sailor had a dark hair, a rosy cheek, and curly mustache. He was walking in very cheeky fashion. George laughed. He looked at the other sailors. All their faces were different. Some were old and some were young, but they all looked friendly and cheerful. George grinned at Mr. Duffy. Sally's really going to love this, he said.